really excited to welcome Emily Candela, and she's a History of Design PhD candidate from the Royal College of Art, and she will talk about atoms, flows, and networks, and the histories of science and design, what fits very well in that context, and the importance of understanding the history of interactions, overlaps, and barriers between design and science to reflect of these current relationships. Welcome.
Thank you. So, as Helena mentioned, I am a PhD candidate. I'm conducting research across the Royal College of Art History of Design Department and the Science Museum. And my research is about relationships between the science of X-ray crystallography and industrial design in the post-war era in Britain. And just to kind of give you some background about what X-ray crystallography is, it's both a technique and a science. Crystallographers study the architecture of atoms in crystals and molecules, as well as macromolecules, things like proteins and viruses. And they do so by shining X-rays through crystals, and at least in the period in which I am studying, they would get something like this, which is a diffraction photograph. This one happens to be of DNA, which is possibly the most famous application of the science. The discovery of the DNA double helix in 1953 was achieved with the help of X-ray crystallography. Then crystallographers sort of intuit they intuited the structure of a molecule and would create visualizations, which is something I'm very interested in. Things like diagrams as well as models like this one, which these are two models for the structure of ice made for the crystallographer Kathleen Lonsdale in the mid-1950s. One's right and one is wrong, actually. But my work is not only about science. An aim of my research has been to develop ways to look at cross-field exchange between science and design, which is an area that we know significantly less about compared to the history of science and art, for example. And so to do so, I work in an interdisciplinary way. I integrate science, art, design, and maybe to think a bit about what is meant by a number of words that come up quite frequently today. Things like interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, and antidisciplinary. I'm interested in exactly what is meant by these. The very idea behind what these words sort of describe in terms of ways of working is that they disrupt or reframe existing approaches. So it's really easy to see them as exceptional, especially because the idea of discipline still orders a lot of the institutions where we work and study and knowledge generation in general. But I'd like to think about it in kind of a different way that my research brings up, which is that in what ways is this kind of work actually unexceptional or embedded in disciplines themselves? How does work that seeks to transcend discipline boundaries actually reflect back on disciplines? So, for instance, how does what we think of as design change when it's subjected to interactions with science? So to think through some of these questions, I'm going to dismantle an icon from the history of science and design, which is the Festival Pattern Group. So this was a project for the 1951 National Exhibition, the Festival of Britain, which brought together dozens of manufacturers, mostly of domestic products, things like window glass, carpets, cutlery, wallpaper, to derive patterns based on the diagrams made by X-ray crystallographers and their sort of cutting-edge research at the time. And this is the cover of their catalog for the Festival of Britain, and you can see a curtain material that's covered in a pattern derived from hemoglobin diagrams and a carpet derived from the visualizations of insulin by X-ray crystallographers. This is insulin lace, or lace with the structure of insulin, hemoglobin fabric again, and a metal sheeting with the pattern derived from the mineral cristobalite. So they were literally incorporating or like putting pictures of atoms on materials. So you can already sort of see the ways in which it's incredibly different from the type of work that was going on in the workshops. But I think that there are ways in which it sort of prompts questions about today as well. This kind of direct and deliberate and product-oriented interaction between scientific work and industrial design was incredibly unusual at the time, which is probably why it's one of the most, or the most famous interaction between science and design from the period. So since 1951, it's sort of been revived. It was shown at the Wellcome Collection in 2008. And I think that this project resonates today more than it actually did in the past, when people weren't very enthusiastic about it, actually, because it speaks to our current interest in these types of relationships. And perhaps because it seems so unique, other historians have looked at it and contributed to the history of the Festival Pattern Group. The Festival Pattern Group was essentially organized like a committee, so it was sort of strange. It was overseen by what is now the Design Council, who met regularly with manufacturers to discuss designs and get diagrams. And the Festival Pattern Group had a scientific advisor, the X-ray crystallographer Helen McGaw, who was actually the first woman on staff at the Cavendish in Cambridge. And she provided the group with the diagrams for their patterns, which seems like a pretty straightforward collaboration, except for the fact that I'm not really sure there is such a thing as a straightforward collaboration. I found that the diagrams that Helen McGaw gave to the designers were not actually conventional crystallographic diagrams. They were hybrids. This is one of myoglobin. It's something called a Patterson plot of the myoglobin structure. This is another one of lithium. They don't look like the crystal structure diagrams that I saw in her laboratory notebooks or that would have been in crystallography journals at the time. They accentuated geometry, repetition, symmetries, and they were very flat. This is a diagram from Helen's own laboratory notebooks. She tended to use three-dimensional projections a lot because she was interested in the orientation of structures. But in her diagrams for the Festival Pattern Group, they were quite different. This is one of the mineral apophyllite. They were inflected by conventions of Victorian design drawing, in fact. These are ones that Helen McGaw had been taught as an adolescent growing up in Ireland, like so many other pupils at the time. And her drawings, which were sort of inflected by design conventions, affected the way that the final patterns by the group looked. Here's some lace that was derived from the apophyllite diagram that she made. And this sort of integration of design drawing with scientific drawing speaks to something I'm interested in, which is flows between fields, the movement and translation of ideas, objects, techniques, and images. And I think that these might be found not only in the places where we are used to seeing them, such as in the direct encounter or the novel object that comes out of that kind of direct encounter. Because for Helen McGaw, what was really important was not the collaboration between the science and designer meeting each other, but the interaction of the scientist with a design practice. And this was sort of rooted in her childhood education, which brings up questions about how interdisciplinary is disciplinary work. One of the originators of X-ray crystallography, William Lawrence Bragg, used pattern design to think about crystal structures. He used these wallpaper patterns from the 19th century arts and crafts designer Walter Crane in one of his books about crystallography from the 30s to describe crystal lattices. So I'm interested in thinking about ways in which maybe design is more a normal part of science than we've noticed. And I think that Helen McGaw's design-inflected diagrams also brings up questions that might apply today about power and agency in cross-field relationships. Sort of questions about, well, who is doing the border crossing? More often than not, today we see designers working with scientific practices or engaging with science. But it's not always so obvious the way in which sometimes subtle flows can occur in the opposite direction as well. So Helen McGaw was producing these kind of decorative diagrams long before the invention of the festival pattern group. She actually had the idea that they should be used on, that crystal diagrams could be used on textiles and wallpapers a long time before this. She found quite a receptive network of practitioners from art, design, and architecture who were interested in her decorative diagrams. And these circulated among social networks at the time. For example, through the Post. She originally sent them to the Design Research Unit, which was an early design consultancy in London. This is a snapshot of them at work. Misha Black, one of the members, is standing up, who were very interested in her diagrams. One of their members, Marcus Brumwell, sent them to Barbara Hepworth, the artist, who was also quite enamored with Helen McGaw's diagrams. She said, "I think you should produce them exactly as they really are. To me, they're more beautiful than any man-made pattern." This is a diagram of hemoglobin that might have been some of the ones that were circulating among these social networks at the time. And eventually, the architect, Mark Hartland Thomas, saw them, and he initiated the Festival Pattern Group, and then it sort of happened. And many of the people in these networks were receptive to her diagrams because they were already interested in science, many for quite different reasons having to do with their own practices. But they were already involved in these cross-disciplinary conversations. So the Festival Pattern Group, which is this seemingly unique project, at least at first it seems to be, actually arose out of quite active, ongoing cross-field social networks and dialogues. So these are just some of the ways in which I've found that kind of looking below the surface, past what appears to be quite a novel, unique collaboration, is we actually find what appears to be ways in which the impetus for the project is already existing. It's already sort of embedded in working practices and networks. I'd just like to finish up by coming back to what the Festival Pattern Group made. You'll be able to see the sort of similarity between the diagrams and what they made. In this example, this was a silk fabric based on the hemoglobin diagrams. And it's really clear how, looking at this, we can see how different this is from the kind of work that Radical Atoms, for instance, is doing today. It's a different idea of what design is, for one thing. It conceives of design largely as in a sort of aesthetic form-giving process, which is also part of, I think, what Hiroshi was talking about. But the Festival Pattern Group was actually part of this effort at the time to establish the creative role of the designer in industry, sort of part of the development of industrial design as a distinct profession, as it was kind of new at this time. But when these prototypes were exhibited, they actually kind of got the opposite reaction from the design press. The publication Architectural Design featured the Festival Pattern Group in the spring of 1951 and actually put one of Helen McGaw's diagrams on the cover. This is a electron density map of apholite, which was a mineral in concrete, which would have been important to architectural design. But they kind of criticized the project. They saw it as reducing the role of the designer, of letting science and sort of the structures of nature themselves take over the design process. They said, there's much to be said for evolving this vocabulary of pattern, not as an alternative to creative effort. So they saw this almost as the designer being kind of lazy. But what I find really interesting there is that this entanglement of design with science became wrapped up in debates about what design could be at this time when that idea was quite resonant, which I think prompts interesting questions about how do cross-field relationships affect how we think about design, what it is, what it can be, what it should be, maybe also what it should not be. What does it mean for design when it becomes positioned and entangled with science? Thank you.